thank you so much. It was really a lovely performance. I haven't heard these for about, 10 years or so, and I'm reduced to all sorts of nostalgic jello. Today, a composer and expression. Having wrestled with the composer and tradition, and then composer in process, I thought I would conclude this brief series of efforts to get at some of the rather more difficult and obscure and subterranean questions about writing music and being a composer with composer and expression, a veritable peat bog of difficulty and a swamp of ambiguity, but I'll do my best. I had two principal teachers of composition. I referred already to A.T. Davison as a mentor who meant a great deal to me and whose personality impressed itself on me and has shaped a great deal of the way I feel and teach and think and write and act and behave. But my two principal teachers of composition, Walter Piston and Aaron Copland, and the first insisted that expression was form, and the second insisted that expression was meaning. Expression was form, and expression was meaning. After 3 or 4 years of working with Walter, I never got much farther than the concept that writing music was a matter of conquering architectural resistance, shaping forces, designing material. I don't mean to say for a minute that he did not write expressive music or anything like that, but his impress was that music was architecture, form, that the neater and more compact and more beautifully shaped your forms were, the more expressive your content was. Well, being heavily imbued with this set of precepts, I took my first pieces to Aaron Copland, who was living, I think, up at the Hotel Empire at that time, and I went over for my lessons all afternoon, Wednesday afternoons. And all he asked me were funny questions like, what are you trying to say here? What do you mean by this? What were you thinking of when you wrote this? Why did you say it that way? And I must confess we spent almost a year together in uneasy relationships, I trying to penetrate as to the meaning behind these questions, and suddenly realizing, of course, that what he was trying to do for me was to give me another set of values, another set of attitudes about what expression was. He didn't say for a minute that what I was writing or had been writing was inexpressive or lacking in communicative power or anything of that sort. But he kept asking questions which made me worry more about meaning. What are you trying to say? What do you mean? How do you intend to finish this section? What values are you trying to communicate? Where is the truth in what you are writing? Are you really trying hard enough to say what you mean? Are you trying to write masterpieces only? He was very worried at that time that everything I was trying to do was a masterpiece. I had no such thought, of course, but he was trying to shake me loose from being too serious, too sober, too full of myself, and trying to say, in effect, relax, let come what needs to come, say what you need to say, feel in music. Well, I've run across a rather nice quotation from Descartes. Descartes has a long monograph called Passions of the Soul. And Descartes indicates that there are only 6 which are simple and primitive. That is to say, wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. All others are composed of some of these six or are species of them. Wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. Then he goes on in a later article when he makes the point that wonder is by far the most important of all these six primitive passions. Wonder. He says, we can in a quite special degree say of wonder that it is serviceable in that it causes us to apprehend and to retain in our memory things of which we were previously ignorant. Wonder, in other words, is a key into various locked situations. It is a mechanism for releasing feelings, and it's dangerous. And Descartes goes on later in the monograph to tell you how dangerous it is, and that we mustn't be bemused and befuddled by wonder. And yet wonder is absolutely indispensable to a composer. A composer has to be full at all stages of his life of wonder, that capacity to retain in our memory things of which we were previously ignorant. Claudio Monteverdi, in writing the preface to one of his books of madrigals, says, reflection shows the principal emotions of mankind to be three, not six, but three. Anger, equanimity, and supplication, or humility. Anger, equanimity, and supplication or humility. Quite a different approach to the emotions from that which we've just heard in Descartes. This truth, continuing with Monteverdi's quotation, is corroborated by what the great philosophers say, as well as by the character of the human voice, with its high, low, and middle pitch. It's further manifested clearly in the art of sound through its threefold expressions: passionate, soft, and calm. But though I've carefully searched the works of earlier composers, I've not been able to find any examples of the passionate style, only of the calm and soft. Yet Plato speaks of the agitated style in the third book of the Republic when he describes, this is Plato now, that kind of harmony which fittingly imitates the voice and accents of a brave man going into battle. Close the quote from Monteverdi. In other words, composers and writers about music are concerned indeed with the passions, prime and otherwise. And a composer neglects a concern for passion, as Aaron Copland was trying in his very gentle way to inform me, at my age of 19, that passions needed to be faced and dealt with and understood, because music falls short of fullest expression if one does not recognize and treat of the passions, whether you define them as 6 basic types or as 3 basic types, and no matter what words you use. Now, I've already made allusion to wonder, and I think that there are 2 other words following on passion which have to be understood before we get much farther with expression. One is mystery, and the other is wonder. Mystery and wonder, both very dangerous, and they raise the notion very sharply of the musician, performer, as well as composer, of course, as magician, a theme which is developed very effectively by writers like Hermann Broch, Thomas Mann in Dr. Faustus, course, most specifically, Hermann Hesse. It's a favorite theme of the musician, the composer, musician particularly, as a magician, as an artful, an artisan in mystery. Alfred Barr, the wonderful man who headed the Museum of Modern Art for so many years, in writing of Cubism and Expressionism, says, in speaking of Kandinsky, broadly speaking, Kandinsky's theory of art was mystical, depending upon an awareness of the spiritual in the material, and an expression of this feeling through the material medium of paint. He often thought of painting in terms of music, just as his contemporary and compatriot Scriabin frequently thought of music in terms of painting. Kandinsky, following musical terminology, called his more spontaneous and casual paintings improvisations. One of his most interesting improvisations is number 30. And to continue with the Barr quote, his more calculated works Kandinsky calls compositions. But the key phrase there is Kandinsky's theory of art, which of course underlines the whole expressionistic movement in German art, German literature, poetry, and German music, is that it is mystical, depending upon an awareness of the spiritual. And mystery and wonder, the ability to retain that of which we were previously ignorant, and mystery, which is, so to speak, part of that transformatory process, those processes of metamorphosis, which I talked a good bit about in the second lecture, are both equally important in expression. If you do not deal with the passions, your music tends to be academic and scholastic and sterile. If you do not deal with mystery and wonder, your music tends to be lacking in imagination and in deep outreach. Eugene O'Neill, writing in 1926 of his play The Great God Brown, says, "It is mystery, the mystery any one man or woman can feel but not understand as the meaning of any event or accident in my life on earth. And it is this mystery I want to realize in the theater. The solution, if there ever be any, will probably have to be produced in a test tube and turn out to be discouragingly undramatic." O'Neill, characteristically wry, characteristically acerbic, says he doesn't want to know any of the answers. He wants the mystery to persist, the mystery to be always present in works like The Great God Brown. Jean Cocteau, writing about the same time, about a piece called The Marriage Party at the Eiffel Tower. This is a famous piece for which his close friends, Taillefer, Auric, Honegger, Millot, and Poulenc, wrote music. It's a ballet theatrical piece and very charming, a great period piece of the early 20s. And Jean Cocteau, in speaking of Les Mariés de la Tour Eiffel, says, "Mystery inspires a kind of fear in the audience. In this play, I renounce mystery. I light up everything. I underline everything. Sunday boredom, human cattle, ready-made expressions, dissociations of ideas in flesh and blood, fierceness of childhood, poetry and miracles of everyday life." That's my play, which the young musicians who accompany it have understood so well. I love that phrase, fierceness of childhood, poetry and miracles of everyday life. Mysteries and wonder don't exist out there in some incredible fantasy. They're not out there in some removed and distant and faraway place. Mystery and wonder are all around us. They're interior. And these two quotations, written so close together in the early 20s, of O'Neill, who talks more conventionally about the mystery that any one man or woman can feel but not understand, and Cocteau, who in his characteristic poseur manner disavows mystery. I'll have no mystery in my work. My work will deal with everyday simplicities, everyday realities, everyday commonplaces, dissociations of ideas in flesh and blood, and fierceness of childhood. My word, fierceness of childhood. And childhood is terribly fierce. All you have to do is shut your eyes and think of childhood as came through so often in that first poem of Eliot. It's a poem about childhood. It's a poem about lost innocence, New Hampshire. Very beautiful evocation of the fierceness of childhood. Descartes mentions among his important prime passions love and hatred. And I love this reference of the great classical scholar Bowra, C.M. Bowra, in discussing Phaedrus, the magnificent piece of Plato, which along with the Symposium deals with the highest human values. Bowra says, love is the force which frees the soul for its true activities and brings it into touch with the colorless, shapeless, intangible reality, which is the only harmonious whole. It's a very short quotation, but it's a very beautiful one. Love is the force which frees the soul for its true activities and brings it into touch with the colorless, shapeless, intangible reality, which is the only harmonious whole. And it seems to me that most composers deal with love and hatred all the time in their music. And if they but all understood that it is this force which frees the soul. So well understood in that marvelous dialogue of Plato. Always have quotations from Plato in learned lectures. I don't know why, it seems inevitable. And I apologize for once more falling into, as I said, this swamp in which one turns to the greatest minds for elucidation. And Phaedrus is a place where one does find great elucidation of the passions, and therefore why not accept it? I spoke last time on composer and process, and I used the word technique fairly often. Tried to get the role technique played. There's perhaps a better word, which is more commonly and widely used, and it's a more general word, craftsmanship. Because it seems to me craftsmanship and artistry are two other avenues to understanding the composer in expression. A composer who is not craftsmanlike and who is inartistic may have all kinds of feelings, may understand the passions, may even rule the passions, but without craftsmanship and artistry, there will be, of course, inevitably a failure. There's a rather characteristically dense and somewhat opaque quotation, but it's still quite helpful, I think, by Martin Heidegger, the aesthetician and theologian, writing in 1950, in a very interesting monograph called The Origin of the Work of Art. Heidegger says, we think of creation as producing. Creation of a work requires craftsmanship. Great artists prize craft most of all. It is they, especially, who call for its painstaking cultivation for the sake of complete mastery. They, above all others, constantly concern themselves with ever new training in craftsmanship. It's often enough been pointed out that the Greeks, who knew something about works of art, used the same word for craft and art, and called the craftsman and the artist by the same name. We tend, from our lofty view, our elitist position, to distinguish between artisans, craftsmen, and artists. The Greeks knew better, as usual, and can tell us that in their nomenclature, as Heidegger points out here, the same word for craft and art and for craftsman and artist. Now, the point being that without a mastery, he makes another point here, that it is the great artists who most care about mastery of technique or mastery of craftsmanship. And they most care, of course, because through that mastery they gain a new power of expression. Without mastery, one is clumsy. One is less than swift, less than cogent, and that loss of cogency and loss of refinement which comes with clumsiness is something that a major artist cannot tolerate. Heidegger, in an italicized later phrase from that same essay, says that art is then the becoming and happening of truth. Not a bad quotation. Art is then the becoming and the happening of truth. There's another important word which must be brought into our consciousness this afternoon in connection with expression. That is the word sensations. Sensations. We are all sensate, some degree more acutely than other degrees. We are all what the French call sensible, sensitive to. We are all, in a way, receptors of sensations of all kinds, titillations, important sensations, exotic sensations, ecstatic sensations. And those, to some extent, fuel artists. Painters and poets and musicians, composers, are fueled by ultra-sensitive sensations, so to speak. If they be not sensitive, and if they be not aware of sensation, they are dull. What they have to say lacks finish, lacks color, lacks edge. If we listen to a performance and it is not imbued with the qualities of sensation, it is apt to be pedestrian. And so is creative art. Art which is lacking in the sense of sensation is monodimensional. It lacks rondeur, it lacks breadth. René Dubos, in speaking about human beings in a wonderful book called A God Within, says, we come into contact with the world through the sensations. We perceive with our whole organic being. But there's much more than that to our view of the world. In each of our sensations, we're converted into very personal, conceptual structures by mental processes, which involve our genetic and experiential past and are therefore different from everybody else's mental processes. Each person has a unique picture of the world, largely of his own creation. Paraphrasing Alfred North Whitehead, the English-born mathematician turned American philosopher, it can be said that when we praise the rose for its scent, the bird for its song, the sun for its radiance, the moon for its glow. Nature gets the credit which should go to ourselves. In reality, nature is soundless, scentless, colorless, merely the hurrying of material, endless, meaningless. We, not nature, create from the jumble of external physical phenomena the sounds, scents, colors, and meanings which make up our emotional and intellectual lives. That's an ancient doctrine in philosophy, of course, that the world exists only in the way in which we perceive it. Its reality is the perceived reality. And whether you're talking about Bishop Berkeley or Condillac, you're talking about a doctrine which comes to light every generation. And I think it's very important for creative people to wrestle with that kind of problem. Are the sensations which impinge on me of sense and colors and touch, are those sensations real in some way, or are only real as I perceive, interpret them? Dubos says, we, not nature, create from the jumble of external physical phenomena the sounds, scents, colors, and meanings which make up our emotional and intellectual lives. Well, it seems to me true that in trying to get at the relation of expression and sensations, that composers are constantly wrestling with the jumble of external physical phenomena. And they are trying to give unique meaning to the sounds, scents, and colors. And I'm delighted to see that Dubos speaks of our emotional and intellectual lives. They are not separate, of course, and nor is reason and passion in any manner separate. And in the writing of music and in the wrestling with expressive quantities which we intend to place in music, we need in equal measure quanta of emotional and intellectual data, experience, reality. I was rather amused as I thought about these 3 times with you, because in a sense I was trying to avoid a series of talks on aesthetics. It's a lot easier to talk about the meaning of music or the values of music or the truth in music and so on, all that sort of thing, which is the proper province of aestheticians, than it is to talk about this kind of problem from the other side of the mirror, the obverse, that is from the standpoint of the creative personality, the composer or the artist or the choreographer, the person creating, rather than the object created and its meaning, value, interpretation, and so on. But I couldn't resist 2 quotations to show how topsy-turvy this field is. One is from a Library of Congress Elson lecture of Glenn Hayden. And he says, in the music of the Romantic era, here, at the risk of oversimplifying a rather complex situation, we might say that in general, the composer set himself to the task of expressing in music the entire gamut of man's emotions, moods, and conative impulses. End of quote. That's a nice quotation which says very succinctly what we think composers were about in the 19th century, starting with, let's say, the Beethoven Opus 31 sonatas or the Eroica Symphony, or however you choose to start. The phrase that I've always used for this is the 19th century as the mirror of man, and the composer essentially as the person trying to see through that mirror and reflect the emotions, moods, and conative impulses of the entire gamut. Well, that's a rather nice and rather old-fashioned view of what expression is all about, that the composer, in searching for expression, merely needs to look about him and see around him the loves, the passions, the hatreds, the animosities, the pictures, the images, and transform them through the catalytic kiln of his own imagination, and that comes out as the Mahler Eighth Symphony, which some of you might have heard not so long ago. That's a fine example of an effort to put the entire gamut of man's emotions, moods, and conative impulses into a work of art. Mahler certainly felt, all the way from the Second Symphony on, that that was his task, to interpret the whole of reality, in chunks, if you will, but nonetheless, the whole. Now, you might contrast that with a quotation from a young Leonard Meyer. I might say that he's a dear friend, and he has now mellowed, as I have mellowed, in the 20 years since this quotation. We were in earnest dialogue at this time about many things. This is Leonard Meyer speaking about meaning in music. He says, a system which produces a sequence of symbols, which may of course be letters or musical notes, say, rather than words, according to certain probabilities, is called a stochastic process. And the special case of a stochastic process in which the probabilities depend upon the previous events is called a Markov process, or a Markov chain. And Meyer goes on to say that the fact that music, like information, is an instance of a Markov process has important practical and theoretical ramifications. Well, I quote that with somewhat of a smile. I think I would be forgiven the smile, not because this is not an important monograph. It was one of the first monographs on the idea of music as being approachable through information theory. But I have to contrast Glenn Hayden, whom I shut my eyes and I can see Glenn, a wonderful, courtly man, dealing very much with the humanistic problems, and Leonard Meyer, who is a fierce searcher after new kinds of truth and new kinds of symbolic analysis, an analyst par excellence, using this language of the social sciences and of statistics to describe music, to try to get at a new, unsentimental approach to what music is and the meaning of it. I find it difficult, even in my most charitable and most Catholic moments, to think of music as a Markov chain. It's just not a happy thought for me. I can understand it, and I know what he's talking about, and I think it's a valuable tool, but I guess I really would rather try to express, at least if not the entire gamut of man's emotions, some of them, the ones I'm interested in, rather than assume that music is but a symbolic process generated by we know not what, and therefore inevitable in its course. In a certain way, music has, in its expressive properties, some qualities of logic. If we remove sentimentality, but not sentiment, bathos, but not concern, and that which is empathetic and pathetic from music, we still have logical properties. Music, even the most fervent, hysterical music, is logical. Roger Fry, the interesting critic of art, in one of his last lectures on sensibility, observes, in works of art, the answers to our questions are not given in terms of ordinary logic, meaning presumably the logic of Philo or the logic of Carnap, but in terms of what we may call a logic of the senses. The artist's answers are appeals to our sense of fitness or harmony. There are, of course, people almost entirely lacking in this sense. Thus, in music, the musician's answers depend on our recognition of harmonious and inharmonious relations of the notes. Some people are, as we say, music deaf. That is, you say this feeling is so rudimentary and so underdeveloped in them that they cannot accept the musician's answers as valid. And it's exactly the same in regard to harmonious proportions of form and color, only that people are much less often forced to realize that they are form blind, imagining as they do that recognition of likeness is all the artists expect of them. That's a rather interesting paragraph in which a distinguished art critic likens the problem of looking at a picture and saying, well, I don't like it, I don't understand it, it doesn't mean anything to me, it has no logic, to the problem of understanding and perceiving musical logic, which he says is different from ordinary logic. And I would say that by extension, that the logic which Roger Fry is talking about is the kind of logic that gets into the attempt to refine expression that composers are always worrying about. A composer who does not worry about refinement of expression, honing of it, so to speak, is not concerned with logic. He allows the mechanical, propulsive logic of sequential formations to exist, but he doesn't search out the deeper, what Fry calls the musical logic, which is, of course, what makes great music and great expression. Wouldn't it be nice indeed if all we had to do was to follow the precepts of Giuseppe Zarlino, the great Renaissance theoretician, who writes in Book 4 of his Instituzioni Armoniche, "For if in speech, whether by way of narrative or imitation, and these occur in speech, matters may be treated that are joyful or mournful, and grave or without gravity, and again modest or lascivious, we must also make a choice, a harmony, and a rhythm, similar to the nature of matters contained in the speech, in order that from the combination of these things put together with proportion, there may result a melody suited to that purpose. Thus it will be inappropriate if in a joyful matter a composer uses a mournful harmony and a grave rhythm, and nor where funereal and tearful matters are treated is he permitted to use a joyful harmony and a rhythm that is light or rapid. Call it as we will. On the contrary, he must use joyful harmonies and rapid rhythms in joyful matters, and in mournful ones, mournful harmonies and grave rhythms, so that everything may be done with proportion." Well, that's a charming quotation, which says, in effect, if you want to write sad music, use sad rhythms and sad harmonies. If you want to write joyful music, don't make the mistake of using funereal rhythms and grave rhythms, but use bright harmonies for bright things and somber harmonies for dark things. Well, how nice and how marvelous to have it that easy. A composer has a vocabulary like a medicine chest, and he goes in and he pulls out bottle-marked joy and dumps it into his psyche, and out comes joyful music. Alas, were it so, and maybe it is so. Maybe that is why the writers of commercial music, of background music, of TV music, of jingles and so on, maybe that's really the way it works. There's a bottle, and the bottle says 99 and 9100 pure or something, and it comes out just right. I think there must be something like this. Alas, I've never been able to stock my own medicine chest with these kinds of bottles. Every time I go to write something joyful, I try to think of the last time that meant anything to me, or what it really does mean, or what it meant in terms of some poetry that I know, or some moment of a theater piece, or some other piece of music. And I find that the bottle recipes don't work so well. But Zarlino gives you the recipes. And he goes right ahead in the rest of his book to show you the chords and show you the kinds of things. And there is such a thing as a vocabulary of resources. Every age has it. But I don't think really that's the way the best composers express themselves. Now, a composer, logical, trying to imitate some of the things in the real world, tries always for the highest of which he's capable. I love this quotation from Schoenberg's program notes to the Georg songs, written in 1910. Very serious quotation. Schoenberg says, "With the Georg songs, I for the first time succeeded in approaching an ideal of expression and form, expression and form, you see, not separate, an ideal of expression and form which has been in my mind for years. Until now I lacked the strength and confidence of having broken through every restriction of a bygone aesthetic. And though the goal toward which I'm striving appears to me a certain one, I'm nonetheless already feeling the resistance I shall have to overcome. I feel how hotly even the least of temperaments will rise in revolt, and suspect that even those who have so far believed in me will not want to acknowledge the necessary nature of this development. I am being forced in this direction. I am obeying an inner compulsion which is stronger than my upbringing." That's a marvelous quotation, very characteristic quotation of Schoenberg, who, in the full flower of his young maturity, is saying, for the first time, I've succeeded in reaching an ideal of expression and form which is adequate to my expressive desires, my expressive requirements. Now, as I near the end of these remarks, I might point out a particular problem of the composer and his expression in our time, which is the pervasive and important role of science in the modern world, in our life. We've recently been through an agonizing episode in which our credibility in high technology and in the priestdom of science has been severely battered and severely shaken. There's a very interesting author, a Nobel laureate in the biological sciences, C.H. Waddington, who was a colleague of mine in Buffalo, and we exchanged a good many evenings on this matter. And from his most important book called Behind Reality, a number of statements. I'll read them one after the other because they add up to the general point that I'm trying to make. He says, to put it with the crudity which its importance demands, the scientific contribution to human civilization is its insistence that some things are true and some things are not. Science insists that there is an existing structure in the universe that cannot be talked out of existence by any type of language or system of philosophy. What the scientist wants to ask of the contemporary artist is, does he give expression to this basic challenge which science issues to the older, more self-confidently, self-sufficient systems of intellectual thought, philosophy, and so on? Can it really be claimed that artists have succeeded in going beyond this primary task, to assert that there is an underlying causal structure which cannot be circumvented? And in conclusion to these series of statements by Waddington, he ends this very interesting book with the statement, starting from the argument that science is not, after all, a one-eyed cyclops. The conclusion we've come to is that man is Argus with innumerable eyes, all yielding their overlapping insights to his one being that struggles to accept them in all their variety and richness. I like to think of a composer, I like to think of myself in terms of Argus, with innumerable eyes. Eyes as the symbol of receptors, if you will, of sensations. We began this afternoon with two exquisite performances for which I shall be endlessly grateful to these young people and to Elmer Thomas for. They evoked everything that A.T. Davidson would have been very proud of, and they brought me back to some of that fierceness of childhood. I was about 20 or so when I wrote these. That is a little bit hard for me to cope with. So I thought it might be interesting to end this afternoon and the series this year with a quotation from T.S. Eliot, from his marvelous poem about advancing years and middle age, if you will, Gerontion. Think now, history has many cunning passages, contrived corridors, and issues, deceives with whispering ambitions, guides us by vanities. Think now, she gives when our attention is distracted, and what she gives, gives with such supple confusions that the giving famishes the craving. Gives too late what's not believed in, and if still believed in memory only, reconsidered passion. Gives too soon into weak hands what's thought can be dispensed with till the refusal propagates a fear. Think neither fear nor courage saves us. Unnatural vices are fathered by our heroism. Virtues are forced upon us by our impudent crimes. These tears are shaken from the wrath-bearing tree. Thank you very much.